It was a bitter December night, the kind where the wind cuts through even the thickest coat. Ellie had just finished her late shift at the diner on 5th Street, her tired feet dragging against the cracked pavement as she made her way home. The streets were deserted, except for the occasional hum of a passing car, its headlights streaking across icy puddles. Ellie lived alone in a cramped apartment 2 blocks from the diner. She had taken the late shifts to save for her overdue rent, but lately, her world felt like a constant loop of fluorescent lights, greasy counters, and too many bills. As she turned onto the street leading to her building, she noticed something unusual. Under the street lamp, at the corner stood a man, motionless, staring up at the light. His shadow stretched long across the ground. He was bundled in a dark overcoat, a grey scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. Ellie slowed her steps. She didn't recognize him, but there was something off. He wasn't looking at his phone or waiting for someone. He was just staring. Ellie's heartbeat quickened. She thought about crossing the street, but her apartment was only a block away, and the idea of retreating felt silly. As she got closer, the man turned his head slightly, his face catching the faint glow of the street lamp. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Do you have the time?" Ellie glanced at her wristwatch. "It's 11:47, she said, her voice cautious. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you. It's almost time." "Time for what?" Ellie didn't ask. She quickened her pace, her boots tapping loudly against the frozen sidewalk. "Wait," the man called after her. His tone wasn't threatening, but something about it made her stomach knot. She stopped reluctantly, turning halfway. "Yes." He stepped forward, stopping just at the edge of the street lamp's circle of light. "Do you live here, on this street?" Ellie's instincts screamed at her to lie, but the question felt oddly specific. "I'm just passing through," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. The man tilted his head, studying her. "Good," he said finally. "You should keep going." Ellie's pulse thudded in her ears. She turned fully now, her voice sharper. "What does that mean?" The man's eyes flicked to the lamp above them, then back to her. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead, he stepped backward into the shadows, vanishing into the darkness like he was never there. Ellie's skin prickled with unease. She stood there for a moment, scanning the street, but he was gone. The wind howled through the empty road, and she suddenly felt very exposed. Hugging her coat tighter, she hurried to her apartment, her breath clouding in the frigid air. When she reached her building, she fumbled with her keys, glancing over her shoulder. No one was there, but the man's words echoed in her head. "You should keep going." Once inside, she locked the door behind her, throwing the deadbolt for good measure. The apartment was small and cold, but it felt safer than the street. She dropped her bag on the floor and went to the window, peeking through the blinds. The street lamp where the man had stood flickered, then went out. The rest of the lamps on the street stayed on, their warm light spilling across the road, but that one corner was plunged into darkness. Ellie's chest tightened. She told herself it was just a coincidence, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stepped away from the window and tried to distract herself, turning on the TV to drown out the silence. A few minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Ellie froze. No one ever came to her apartment unannounced, especially this late. She crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Fields, a kindly woman in her 70s who lived down the hall. Ellie opened the door, relieved. "Mrs. Fields, what are you doing up?" Ellie asked, trying to sound casual. The old woman's face was pale, her hands shaking. "Ellie, did you see him?" Ellie's stomach dropped. "See who?" "The man under the street lamp," Mrs. Fields whispered. "He was here last week, too," I told the building manager. "But," she trailed off, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "he's looking for someone." Ellie's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Fields lowered her voice. It's always the same. He asks for the time, then he disappears. The last person who spoke to him, well, they never came back. Ellie stared at her neighbor, her mind racing. What are you saying? That he's dangerous? Mrs. Fields nodded. I don't know what he is, but you need to be careful. If he spoke to you, just don't go back outside tonight. Promise me. Ellie nodded slowly, though her mind buzzed with questions. Mrs. Fields left, and Ellie closed the door, leaning against it as she tried to calm her breathing. She stayed awake for hours, watching the window. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell asleep on the couch. When she woke the next morning, the street lamp was fixed, glowing steadily in the daylight. The man was gone, and the street looked perfectly normal. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She never took the late shift again, and every night, as she walked home, she avoided the corner with the street lamp, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored. Ellie didn't hear from Mrs. Fields the next day. At first, she assumed the old woman was resting, but by evening, the hallway outside her apartment was bustling with commotion. Paramedics wheeled out a stretcher covered in a white sheet, and a police officer spoke quietly with the building manager. Ellie's stomach turned as she overheard fragments of the conversation. She was found in her chair, the officer said. No signs of forced entry. But her face. Ellie stepped back, her hand trembling on the doorknob. Mrs. Fields had looked terrified the night before, but now she was gone. The man's words came rushing back. It's almost time. That night, Ellie didn't sleep. She watched the street lamp from her window, waiting for something or someone to appear. Hours passed, and the street remained quiet. But just as dawn broke, she saw it. A faint shadow lingering at the corner, right beneath the flickering light. It wasn't just a man. There were others now. Shadows shifting, their outlines barely visible in the growing light of morning. Ellie backed away from the window, her heart pounding. She realized then that the man wasn't just a stranger. Beneath a street lamp, he was a harbinger. And whatever he was waiting for, it wasn't over.